Agatha, whodunit? There wasn't a cloud in the sky. I could feel the sun's rays on my skin through the windshield. It was still technically spring, but if you didn't know any better, you'd have thought that summer had arrived early. I couldn't have predicted how calm the weather was after the storm that tore through the southwest of England throughout the night. When the howling winds outside my bedroom window kept me up, I made an excuse not to come. But as soon as I woke up and felt the warmth and the light breeze, I quickly changed my mind. I don't get out very often. My choice, though, since my introverted personality prefers small groups of people. I've always been that way. I remember when I used to play football in my teens, over 40 years ago. I never, ever spoke a word in the changing room whenever we had team chats. I could talk in groups of 5, but if there were more people than that, I became as quiet as a mouse. Believe it or not, this was the reason cited in my divorce from the mother of my 2 daughters. My ex claimed that I had turned into a recluse who just wanted to stay at home, reading books, painting, and doing gardening. It bothered me at the time mainly because we had been married for 25 years and helped raise 2 wonderful daughters. But by that point in our marriage, the girls had moved out of our Exeter home to find new lives, leaving me and my wife drifting apart emotionally. Looking back now, it was the right thing to do since we never really did much as a couple, and we had given up on sex many moons ago. We were even living in separate bedrooms, which I thought was normal at the time. My divorce went through 7 years ago, and I haven't managed to find a companion since. I haven't really been looking, to be fair. My ex-wife has found someone who likes to go hiking, run half marathons, and go skiing in the winter, so that's good for her. Both our daughters moved to London the first chance they had. My youngest is still there working, while my oldest, Harper, has since moved to Torquay. I think that was why she picked today's events, since they were closer to her. She had organized it for my Christmas present. She said the booking for it was in such high demand that she had to book it 8 months in advance. I was genuinely looking forward to it, even though I didn't quite see the appeal when Harper first told me about it 5 months ago. Maybe the sunshine brightened my spirits while I drove through the country roads up to the grand estate. The only road leading to it was pretty tight, barely enough for 1 car to get through. Luckily, there weren't any coming the other way as I drove in. When I saw the 3-story white mansion, I felt butterflies in my tummy. It was quietly nestled in between lots of trees, a stone's throw away from the river. The property was owned by the National Trust since it used to be the holiday home of Agatha Christie, one of my favorite crime authors. I have read all her books and watched every one of her TV shows on more than one occasion. When the girls first moved to London, they had surprised me and the wife with tickets to see The Mousetrap in London's West End, the longest-running show in the theatre district's history. Harper said she wouldn't be able to join me today until later, since she had to work for a few hours in the morning. She said lunch was included in the tour of the property. Other than that, there isn't much else to do other than enjoy the views. As soon as I parked my car in the visitors' car park, I made my way towards the house. The car park was already full, so maybe I was the last to get there. The walk to the house was longer than I thought it would be. I had to walk back along the single-track road in order to access the path that led to the property. I had to stop to get my breath back. It was also an excuse to admire the house's architecture. When I inched closer, I noticed the front door had a small porch above it that was supported by 2 tall circular columns. Even though the building was 3 stories high, it also had 2 one-story high structures formed to either side of the main part of the house. They were roughly the same size as a typical garage, but they too had a porch at the front, with each of them supported by 3 white circular columns. The house had so many windows, the front façade alone had 14, not including the front door. Only 1 window had its curtains closed in the top, far left room. I was curious to find out why that was. Was it just the case of an employee forgetting to do so? If only I had brought my brushes and paints. I could have easily planted my easel right here and drawn the house. My train of thought was quickly interrupted by the sound of two people rudely having a shouting match. I searched around the property, but for the life of me, I couldn't see anyone. And yet their argument carried on and on. It was so uncomfortable that I had to get as far away from it as fast as I could. It was just relentless screaming back and forth with no actual context to the dispute. So cringy. I finally reached the front of the house. I observed its beauty close up. It had been well maintained over the years. After Agatha's death in 1976, her husband remained living there until he died 2 years later, and then their kids enjoyed the property until it was officially handed over to the National Trust. The views from the front door were incredible, rolling hill after rolling hill in between a wide river. By now, I had detected that I hadn't seen a single other person yet, other than hearing that full-blown argument. I thought it was rather strange how I hadn't seen another soul so far. But then I remembered Harper telling me not to be too early or that I'd have to wait in my car until they opened. I had one last stare up at that solo window where the curtain had closed over. I waited patiently for someone to appear, or at least move a little, but nothing. When I entered the house, I was rudely greeted by a pretty young employee who immediately asked me for my name. She didn't say hi or ask how I was doing. She just demanded name in an agitated manner. I noticed a Japanese couple in their 30s at the far end of the long hallway, whispering to one another as they admired an old painting on the wall at the bottom of the staircase. I wondered if they also received the same friendly welcome as I got. I couldn't help but notice the curved staircase behind them and the many mirrors and paintings on the walls. When I answered the hostess with my name, she slapped a sticky bit of paper with Paul written on it straight onto my shirt, which happened to be where my left nipple was. I don't know why I suddenly froze, whether it was the weight of the heavy slap or because it happened to land, unbeknownst to her, right on my nipple. As I remained still, I stared at her. I could just tell by her demeanor that she didn't want to be here, like it had been a proper hassle for her to get out of bed. It was also obvious from her lack of attention, from her eyes, and the way she chewed gum, that she probably thought this job was beneath her. The longer I stared at her, the more uncomfortable she was acting. She kept raising her eyebrows at me, like I was an old pervert. But I just couldn't find the words to describe how I was feeling towards this rude woman. "Is this man bothering you, Rebecca?" a male voice asked from behind me. I looked away from the employee to find the chef standing, glaring at me. He was wearing a typical chef's outfit, all white, with the classic tall boy type hat on his head, which was way taller than his actual face. He also wore blue-tinted glasses, so I could only just make out the irate stare in his eyes. But the most obvious thing was his mustache. It was very similar to Poirot's himself, with it curly at each end. He looked like he was in his early 30s, while the pretty young hostess appeared to be only around 18 years old. By now, the Japanese couple who had previously admired the painting had their attention set on us. Rebecca breathed in heavily before answering him. "No, Dave," she said in a frustrated manner. The chef continued to stare me down. "Well, if he did become a problem, you know who to come to for help," he said in a confrontational way. "If you both would excuse me," Rebecca said rudely, before giving me another scowling look as she stepped away from us both. The chef and I watched on as she stormed out the hallway and through the already open door that led into the lounge area. Then we watched as the couple awkwardly followed behind her, while the man studied me up and down. As soon as they were gone, the chef turned to me. "Sorry, I thought you were harassing her," he said to me while he shrugged his shoulder. He looked genuinely sorry. "Keep this to yourself," he said casually as he leaned in closer to me. "We hooked up last week, and she's been giving me the cold shoulder ever since. I have to know whether we're cool or not." He leaned back and gave me a creepy smile. "I'm sure she's fine and always this bubbly at her job," I said sarcastically. The chef stared at me for a brief moment before he smiled. "Nah," he laughed. "Rebecca's always this crabbit. Anyway, I need to get back to the kitchen. I'm waiting for the gardener to bring me a load of rosemary leaves from the garden." He began to leave through a different door before he turned back to me. "You take it easy, geezer." And just like that, he was gone. "Everyone in here, please," a woman shouted from the lounge. That was my cue to enter. The room was fairly packed while the rest of the guests were all sitting down on the couches and armchairs. The room was exactly how the Christie family had left it. A beautiful white mantelpiece with an old wood burner inside. A large, elegant mirror was fixed to the wall above it, which was even bigger than the mantelpiece. The lamps on the side tables next to the armchairs looked like 100-year-old vases. There was an old piano in the corner, covered in photo of Agatha and her family. The room wouldn't be complete without the antique furniture and many ornaments, a common theme to Agatha's interior taste. There were 10 people in total, including me, mostly couples, except for a group of 3 who had purposely dressed up for the occasion. It was a real shame how they had on the entire Sherlock Holmes outfit, trench coat, pipe, deerstalker hat, and a magnifying glass, as opposed to Poirot, Agatha Christie's fictional detective. Even though they had made this common mistake, they still seemed pretty chuffed with themselves. The tour guide introduced herself, while I appreciated her outfit. She had a shirt on, underneath a smart tweed jacket, topped off with a knitted bucket hat, with a tiger skin scarf around her neck. In was in the same style as Miss Marple, another of Agatha's fictional detectives. The first thing she told us was that we weren't to speak to any of the employees unless spoken to, and if we had a problem, we were to come to her. She explained this afternoon's plan of action, a guided tour of the house, followed by a roam of the garden and its surrounding property, followed by a 3-course lunch for all the guests in the dining room. The tour guide clarified that she was also the manager. On top of those roles, she was also a crime writer herself, and if anyone was interested in reading her work, she would have some available to share after lunch when there would be an introduction on how to think like detectives, Poirot and Miss Marple, an event she would personally present. The fact that she was taking advantage of her position as manager to exhibit her own writing skills made me question her professionalism. Rebecca, the hostess, stood in the corner of the room by the piano, still completely disinterested in her job, as the manager spoke, while she hadn't noticed the 3 Sherlock sets of eyes had been constantly studying her. Rebecca couldn't keep her eyes or her eyebrows still. They were up and down, and her eyes remained pointed to the carpet. She rolled them every time the manager said something interesting. That's when I realized that I had been watching Rebecca for longer than I should have been, and if anyone had seen me, they'd have assumed I was somewhat romantically interested in her. She was a very attractive young woman, but she was most likely vain, and that's an immediate turn-off for me. Not that an 18-year-old would have any interest in a 57-year-old man. At that point of the tour guide's introductions, another employee entered the room wearing a sort of maid-slash-waitress outfit, the type that would have been worn around the time when Agatha lived here. The lady, who was probably in her 40s, strolled across the room towards the manager, where she proceeded to whisper into her boss's ear, and a frown instantly appeared on the manager's head. The maid stepped back and patiently waited for a response. She didn't have to wait long, a moment or two before the manager gave her a subtle nod. The poor maid appeared overwhelmed as she turned around to walk back the way she came, only to carelessly trip over the coffee table and fall to the carpeted floor. She appeared embarrassed as she bounced right back up onto her feet before she oddly stared at one of the female guests, whom she then apologized to over and over again. The maid-slash-waitress even used the woman's name like she knew who she was. The female guest appeared to be in her 50s, with one of those faces that you couldn't help but recognize. She was here with a boy, presumably her son, who couldn't have been any older than 14. The female guest was sympathetic to the maid, explaining that it happens all the time and how she was doing a good job. The maid was blushing as she eventually left the room. I watched as the manager's eyes lit up as she stared at the female guest before she made it known that a celebrity, none other than one of the hosts of a popular daytime TV talk show for women, would be joining them today. That explained why I hadn't quite recognized her. But putting this celebrity under the spotlight on her day off was the improper thing to do. The last thing she needed was for other guests to randomly point their phones at her when she was trying to enjoy a quiet day out with her son. The TV presenter would now have to make a request for privacy, but in a way that did not sound self-indulgent. Instead, she politely moved past the awkwardness and stated that she and her son were looking forward to the tour. The tour ended up being rather interesting. I couldn't believe I hadn't recognized the house from one of the Poirot TV shows, where it was used to film Dead Man's Folly. Apparently, when she was alive, the house alone inspired Agatha to write 4 of her novels. More Christie family photos were scattered around the house, including their original furniture, fixtures, and ornaments. The best part was all the memorabilia in her office, where she spent writing her books. Throughout the tour, I got to learn more about the other guests. The celebrity TV presenter barely said a word while her son spent the entire tour on his phone. The 3 Sherlocks were actually brothers, even though neither of them looked alike. They spent the tour daring each other to steal stuff, mainly the skull-shaped tobacco jar that they could use to store their weed. They also kept asking the tour guide sexual innuendos, hoping she would slip up and say something sexually misleading back. The Japanese couple from earlier whispered Japanese back and forth the entire time to one another, even when the tour guide was speaking. Lastly, there was a middle-aged couple who were clearly well off by their fashion sense and jewelry, a lot of gold and Louis Vuitton. They barely said anything other than when they played this game where they guessed how much something was worth, like the house, artwork, or any random Agatha memorabilia. They would then ask the tour guide if she knew the value, whichever of the couple's valuation was closest. They would celebrate by shouting yes, loud enough for everyone to hear, hoping someone would ask them about their game, but nobody did. Once the interior tour was over, we were allowed to roam freely around the house and its private garden. I walked past Rebecca as I stepped out the back door while she was entering. I tried giving her a glaring look, but she avoided eye contact with me completely. So she should, after the way she had acted. It wasn't until I was outside that I noticed that same window with its curtains closed over. I couldn't recall a single room during the tour that had curtains like that. The more I thought about it, I didn't remember seeing any closed doors either. I made a mental note to go back inside at some point and find out why those curtains weren't open, even if it meant asking the tour guide. The walk around the garden was lovely. I was half expecting Harper to turn up, but there was still no sign of her. My mind drifted as something grabbed my attention. What looked like seeds were scattered on the pathway. In fact, there was a trail of them leading all the way up to the house. I picked one up to examine it closely when I was interrupted. "Just leave my seeds." An Irish voice shouted from behind me. "I'll get it all cleaned up." I turned around to find the gardener standing with gardener scissors in his hands, staring at me. He was maybe 30 yards away, wearing green wellies with matching overalls, a straw hat and sunglasses. I couldn't help but stare at his mustache. It was just like the chef's, or should I say Poirot's, with the curly ends. It made me wonder whether the male staff were being forced to mimic the great detective's look to enrich the Agatha experience for us visitors. "I'll get to it in a moment, sir," he said with his Irish accent. "Just enjoy the rest of your walk." I gave him an awkward smile as he continued to stare at me before I finally went back to my walk. Once I had enjoyed the surroundings of the property, I made my way back to the house. I was beginning to feel peckish when I noticed the crowd of guests standing by the single-track road. When I made my way over there, I immediately realized the reason for all the commotion. A tree had fallen onto the access road, thus blocking cars from going in and out of the car park. The high winds from the last night's storm must have done the damage. I wasn't too worried. I was sure there was a farmer nearby with a tractor who could shift it in no time. I noticed there wasn't a single staff member to be seen, not even the gardener, although I could see that he had left his garden scissors lying by the side of the road. I turned around to face the house, hoping to find the manager walking this way, but there was nobody. As I watched the house, something caught my eye. The curtains were now open in the top left room window. How odd! Finding the answer to my question would have to wait, as my train of thought was distracted by my fellow guests as they complained about the tree and how they had things to do later. Even the Japanese couple were shouting all sorts of things in their language, which came across as hostile. Finally, the chef and the maid/waitress could be seen making their way towards us from the direction of the house. They didn't seem so happy about the situation either, as they both went on their phones to make some calls, leaving us all to continue moaning amongst ourselves. The wife of the wealthy couple even suggested that we should all try to move it ourselves. So, all 10 of us built ourselves up along the long, thick tree while she gave out the orders. After the count of 3, we all heaved at the same time, only to realize the task was impossible. Once the chef clocked on what was happening, he intervened and told us all to stop just as the manager finally appeared. She told us all not to stress and that the tree would be gone from the road by the time the rest of today's events were complete. The chef then confirmed that lunch was ready to be served. He didn't have to tell us twice before we all headed back to the house. The first thing I noticed as we entered the dining room was all the natural light created by the full-height windows that had red velvet curtains. As we sat down at the gloss walnut 1940s dining room table, I noticed the one empty seat next to the group of brothers who were dressed up as Sherlock Holmes. I counted everyone at the table. There were now only 9 of us, while 2 out of the 3 brothers had remained. Other than the staff, nobody had actually tried to speak to me, but at the same time, I hadn't made any effort to spark a conversation with them either. The meals were soon served pretty swiftly, one after another. Salmon followed by steak pie. I said very little as I eavesdropped on everyone else's conversations while we ate. Mainly the wealthy couple whom I found interesting, while I firmly criticized them inside my head. The wife was actually a retired police officer, that's how she referred to herself. But I had the feeling that something else had happened, and she had accepted a lump sum in order for her to leave. She kept comparing her old job to Agatha Christie's books, as if DNA evidence would have solved the fictional murders without the need for a detective. Her husband was still focusing on finances and whether he should buy this house and turn it into a hotel casino since he could easily afford it. Then, after a few years, he'd sell it for a massive profit. The celebrity presenter had pulled her phone out in between courses while her son was still glued to his. She had brought to his attention that she had amassed over 8,000 likes for the picture she posted on Instagram of herself outside Agatha's house. Her son's response was, "Good for you, Mum," but he never lifted his head from his phone. The 2 brothers were bored as they, too, sat on their phones to pass the time. It was as if the fallen tree had killed everybody's vibes. Even the Japanese couple barely said a word to one another. As we all enjoyed our steak pies, I could hear the chef ask the maid/waitress if she'd seen Rebecca, as she was meant to be helping him in the kitchen. It wasn't just me who stopped eating to listen and react to the conversation. I caught the manager eavesdropping before she confirmed that Rebecca would most likely be skiving in one of the toilets, watching TikTok on her phone. Unlike the other courses, it was the chef who brought our desserts to the table, not the waitress. I was last to receive my slice of strawberry mint cheesecake. Just as the chef was about to place the plate in front of me, our eyes uncomfortably met when we both heard a female voice scream from elsewhere in the house. He continued to stare into my eyes before he finally placed the plate on the table. Simultaneously, the maid/waitress came rushing into the dining room with panic written on her face. She didn't say anything. She stood holding the door open while she stared deep into the eyes of the chef. They both had a moment together that appeared like a telepathy conversation before the chef spoke. "It's Rebecca, isn't it?" he asked, as his eyes turned swollen. The maid/waitress didn't respond. Instead, she looked to the floor while she squeezed her lips tight together. The chef rushed past her as he left the room in a hurry. The maid/waitress began looking at us all as she remained still. I was the first to get up out of my seat. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity that urged me to follow the chef out of the dining room and up the stairs. While I stepped foot on the top floor, I couldn't help but notice the others below me, who also wanted to find out what was going on. I followed the chef into one of the bedrooms, then through another open door. In the next room, I found Rebecca lying on the floor as the chef sat over her. He immediately gazed up at me while I stood still at the door. "She's dead, Paul," he said, disheartened. "She's been strangled." I slowly walked towards him and the dead body. Her head lay on its side while her eyes were completely shut. Within seconds, everyone else had pushed themselves in to see Rebecca. Most people didn't say anything, and a couple of them gasped. The chef remained sat over her as he closely watched everyone's reactions. Some of the guests even gave me a funny look within seconds of seeing the dead body. The ex-officer started barking out orders about not touching anything, as everything could be used as evidence. My head began questioning whether this was real or just part of the event, a guided tour with lunch and a show. It also dawned on me that Harper still hadn't turned up. I could only foretell that she got held up at work. I couldn't even text her to find out if the Christmas gift she got me included a murder mystery, since I had left my phone in the car. I had another notion while I stared out the bedroom window. I worked out that we were standing in the top, far left room of the house when facing the front of the property, which meant those curtains were the ones that had been closed over earlier this morning. But why are they open now? Does it have something to do with this apparent murder? As I turned around, all the guests were still standing, crowded around the chef and the dead body, when my eyes were met by the manager. She was standing by the door. Some of the guests had noticed our stares back and forth. I couldn't help but feel judged. The manager told us all to go wait in the lounge while she called the police to report the murder. Everyone, including myself, did as she asked. As we all gathered inside the lounge, it wasn't only the guests, but the chef and the maid/waitress were also there. I carried out another count of the guests. There were now 8, including myself. That's when I noticed only one of the Sherlock Holmes remained. I couldn't help but question the storyline of Dead Man's Folly, the Agatha Christie novel that was filmed in this very house for the TV show. The premise of the story is that a crime writer organizes a murder party on the grounds of a country home when someone dies. So, does that mean this is just a game? Was the hostess actually killed? Which would mean that we're here to investigate who the killer is. It then hit me. The manager told us all earlier that she was a crime writer too. Did I just crack the case already? I was about to bring up my findings when the manager, who stood in the middle of the room, began speaking. "We all need to remain calm," she told us, while she emphasized the calm part with the use of raising and lowering her hands in the air. "The police have been called, and they'll be here shortly. It's important that we all stay here since the killer is in this very room among us." The room went deadly quiet while everyone began studying one another. I realized it was best that I sat down on the couch. While I walked the few steps to sit down, I noticed everyone was now closely watching me, and not only that, but there were a few whispers among them. I glanced at the manager, who couldn't help but give me a smirk. I started to feel uncomfortable. I thought about Harper again, while I wondered whether she had, in fact, made it, only to be stuck in that narrow road due to the felled tree. "What about the tree trunk?" I suddenly blurted out. The manager gave me a look like I had just said a slur. "What about it?" she asked. "Has it been moved yet?" I asked. She briefly glanced at the chef. "No, it's still blocking the road." she confirmed as our eyes met. I stood up. I just need to see if my daughter is perhaps out there waiting for me. I began walking towards the door. Paul, the manager said, blocking my exit. You can't leave. I looked around the room, hoping someone would say something in my defense, but they were whispering amongst themselves while their eyes focused on me. I won't be long. I only want to see if she made it okay, I tried to explain. Paul, there's been a murder, she said in a serious tone. No Taggart reference intended. She stared at me like I was the bad guy. Maybe she was trying to insinuate to the others that it was me who did it to create some drama. I'll still be a part of the game when I return. I tried to justify how important this was. Game, she said, laughing sarcastically. There's a dead girl upstairs. This is no game. Is this part of the entry ticket? Perhaps the quicker I work out who did it, the quicker I can go find Harper. I sat back down and gave everyone a fake smile. Maybe we should start with you, Paul, since you appear so eager to leave, the manager said as she judged me with her folded arms. If that's your real name, where were you when the tree fell? I looked around the room once again. Everyone was waiting for what I had to say. I was walking around the garden, enjoying its beauty. I confidently confirmed. By yourself? She asked in a precarious manner. My daughter was supposed to. She interrupted me. It's a bit convenient that you want to go find your daughter, she said, while she used her fingers to portray inverted commas. The daughter, who would be the only person that could possibly give you an alibi. I never said she was with me when the tree fell. So, you admit it then? She said like she had somehow outsmarted me. You were alone, so nobody can vouch for you. But, I managed to say before I was interrupted again. He was harassing the hostess this morning, the ex-officer highlighted. The chef had to step in. The chef immediately appeared shocked that he was being mentioned. Paul was being a creep, he said, while trying to sound unbiased. No, I wasn't. I shouted immediately. You're the creep. I shouted back. The chef looked at the manager as if he was hoping she would stick up for him. By this point, I was too annoyed. If this was all a game, then they wouldn't be calling me a creep. What about you? I asked the manager. I no longer cared about being a spoilsport. I decided to ruin the game for everyone. Where were you earlier when the tree fell down? And you've clearly got makeup around your neck to make it look like someone has tried to strangle you. The manager exhaled as she looked around the room. Everyone by now was obviously staring at her neck. She dropped her head into the palm of her hands while she shook her head. She seemed bewildered as she removed her hands. Yes, thank you, Paul, she said, sounding deflated. You are, in fact, correct. This is makeup. If you recall, I was wearing a silk scarf around my neck during the tour that I purposely removed. Did anyone here, by any chance, make it down to the boathouse? She asked the room. The one from the book, or an actual boathouse? Asked the female celebrity. Both, the manager stated. The room went quiet. I tried to work out where she was going with all of this and what it had to do with this fake murder. Those who are familiar with Agatha's book, Dead Man's Folly, if you were paying attention during the tour, you would have remembered it was filmed here. And if you recall the storyline, the local girl Marlene Tucker is paid by the wealthy Sir George Stubbs to play dead for his murder game. But the twist is that she actually ends up being killed in the boathouse. So, are you trying to say this whole thing has been a game? Asked the TV presenter. The manager paused before she answered, yes. Everyone immediately became relieved as their stiff bodies relaxed. Oh, what a shame, the presenter said, disappointed. That would have been a great story for my viewers. Can I have that apology now, for being labeled a creep? You all were supposed to find me strangled in the boathouse, the manager explained. And then you had all worked out who most likely would have wanted me dead before I would walk in and reveal it had all just been a clever game to get you all thinking like true detectives. The room went quiet again as everyone's jaws dropped. The celebrity presenter was the first to move as she went onto her phone before placing her glasses on her nose. "So, the dead body upstairs is real?" the last remaining Sherlock asked out loud. The manager watched as the female presenter tapped away on her phone, presumably tweeting the news to her fans. "Sorry," the manager politely said to her. "Could you kindly refrain from posting anything online?" The manager kept eye contact directly with her as she continued to tap. The female celebrity finally stopped as she lowered her head to glare over her glasses towards the manager, then slowly locked her phone and placed it back in her handbag. "It's not against the law to discuss the murder between you all," the manager explained. "But the police will not like the details being leaked before they've even got here." "Well, I didn't do it," the former officer explained while she managed to sound guilty. "I was in the garden, fast-timing my friend in Dubai." "What about your husband?" the remaining Sherlock asked. I randomly had a flashback of a cringe moment between her husband and the hostess in Agatha's library. He was showing off his expensive Rolex to Rebecca. Not only was he allowing Rebecca to touch his watch, but he didn't stop her when she casually touched his arm and hand in a flirtatious manner. I also remember looking around for his wife when I caught her growling at them both from the other side of the room as they fondled his expensive timepiece. The whole incident was rather seedy due to the fact that everyone on the tour watched it transpire, even the manager, which then triggered a public argument. It led to the manager pulling Rebecca into the hallway while we all admired Agatha's vast book collection, when we had to endure her berating the young woman. It was during that reprimanding that the manager let slip that not only were they both sisters, but their father didn't pull yet another favor to get his youngest daughter a job, only for her to make a mockery of him behind his back. The manager then warned her along the lines of, "You know what dad's like. He's traditional, it's in their culture." I had to ask myself the question, were we all meant to hear that argument? Was it part of the show? What about the missing Sherlock brother? Where was he? He couldn't possibly be a part of the show. But what if he was? What if he tried his luck with the pretty young woman, and she rejected him? Could he have strangled her and done a runner? "What do you mean? Where was I?" the husband rhetorically asked. "I was with her while I smoked my Cuban cigar," he snapped back. "Where were you then?" he asked the Sherlock. "I can confirm the smell of smoke in the garden," the celebrity presenter confirmed. "The smell of a cigar makes me all nostalgic because my dad used to smoke them when I was a girl." For the record, the Sherlock calmly revealed, "We were down at the river throwing stones." "An unlikely story," the husband snidely said. "He's telling the truth," I said out loud. "I remember seeing people down by the river that appeared to look like they were stone skimming." "Really, Paul? Because I don't remember seeing you outside at all," the husband announced while putting me on the spot. "I also recall you were the last to join us at the tree trunk." A few of the guests began to nod their heads in agreement. "You saw what happened earlier between the chef and the hostess. You thought you could take advantage of a young pretty woman in distress and give her a shoulder to cry on. Am I right, creep?" He really was gunning for me. Maybe it was because he was the one who had something to hide. Or maybe he noticed all the eye rolls and judgy looks I gave him, and he's now making it personal. The bully was referring to a moment that had occurred during the house tour, when the tour guide pointed out the views of the nearby river and the rolling glens, when we all noticed the chef and Rebecca standing below the window chatting and vaping together. It all seemed normal until the chef tried to hold her hand, and for whatever reason, she refused it and threw his hand back at him. She then oddly stared off into the distance before swiftly turning her attention back on the chef and punching him on the arm. He watched on as she stormed back into the house. Everyone on the tour saw this, including Rebecca's sister. I was about to reply to the man's accusations when I felt the anxiety take over my body as soon as I spotted everyone's subjective eyes glued on me. "Well," the manager casually said out loud, "the police are en route, so either way, Paul will have to explain himself to them. I stared at the Japanese couple, hoping that they would stick up for me since they saw how rude Rebecca had been earlier. But as soon as our eyes met, they awkwardly looked away. Whenever I read mystery books or watch detective shows on television, the suspect is always the least suspicious, which in this case was the Japanese couple. I bet they can speak English, but choose to remain silent. I've had enough. I got up from the couch and headed straight for the door. I wasn't waiting for the next insult to come my way. "Paul," the manager shouted attentively. "I'll happily wait outside for the police," I told her when I opened the door. I could see her glaring in the direction of the chef when I left the room. As I entered the hallway, I could hear a male voice shout, "He's been eyeballing that hostess all day." I knew that was going to come back and bite me in the arse. I kept walking through the hallway and out the front door. I didn't stop to look over my shoulder while I headed along the path towards the road. "The road is still closed, Paul," I heard the manager shout. "You have nowhere to hide." I stopped dead. Was I trying to run away from the situation instead of sticking up for myself? I turned around, and everyone was now standing still on the pathway 10 yards in front of me. They all gawked at me, even the Japanese couple. "I didn't do this," I finally spoke up. "I don't know about you all, but I thought this was all a game until I was accused of being a creep. A murder hunt, but based on another Agatha Christie book, and then there were none. I presumed we were all going to be playfully killed off, just like the two missing brothers." "You can come out now," I shouted loud enough for my echoes to travel around the property. Everyone looked around, expecting to see the two men dressed in Sherlock's costumes casually appear, but they didn't. The manager looked at me as she raised her eyebrows. "Did you kill them too?" the wealthy husband boldly asked. I gave him a glare. "Don't worry, I'll get to him in a minute." I raised my chin high while pointing my finger towards the chef. "Why are you picking on me when the chef was up to no good, considering he was taking advantage of Rebecca's naivety in order to sleep with her? And he told me he was getting rosemary from the garden, but there ended up being 0 rosemary in any of our courses." I paused as I studied the chef's face, while everyone else appeared confused by my rosemary statement. But it wasn't the chef who killed her. The killer was lurking outside when the chef grabbed Rebecca's hand. She was actually staring into the killer's eyes before she punched the chef. "Her sister," I said, while I turned to the manager. "Sorry, I don't even know your name." "Angela," she stated quietly, while she allowed me to continue. Angela may well have been a little jealous of all the attention her younger sister gained, but she was only looking out for her when attention was given to her by the wrong type of person. I paused to make sure everyone was aware that I was staring at the wealthy husband. It wasn't until I remembered what she told Rebecca before she ended up dead. "He's traditional. As soon as someone mentions that, you immediately think of religion. And which religion demands 0 sex before marriage? The Catholic Church, of course. Not only that, but Angela said culture, which you don't normally say about someone who grew up in the same country as you. So which country is known for its strict Catholic laws?" "Ireland," the ex-police officer was quick to answer. "Bingo," I said with distinction. That's when I recalled seeing something unusual next to Rebecca's body. "Seeds!" I shouted loud enough for effect. That's how I worked out who the ashamed father was, who had discovered his daughter was sleeping with the chef. He was none other than... I was rudely interrupted by the ex-female officer, the gardener. She said out loud while stealing my moment of glory. I stared at the tour guide, hoping she would agree, when I was interrupted by the sound of somebody clapping their hands, slow and sarcastically. I turned my head 90 degrees to find the culprit walking my way from behind the head-high bushes, the gardener. The same man from earlier with the Poirot mustache, sunglasses and straw hat. He kept clapping as he slowly walked closer. Once he was 10 yards from us all, he stopped, ripped the fake mustache from over his lip, and removed the sunglasses before, finally removing the straw hat. All of a sudden, my chin dropped to the ground when I realized it wasn't a man but my daughter Harper. She had a massive grin on my face as she began clapping again, but this time properly, in recognition. The manager, the chef, and the maid/waitress all joined in. All the guests seemed confused, and they didn't know where to look. "Well done, Daddy," she said, still smiling. I felt a grin tense my cheekbones as she came over and gave me a hug. Everyone soon realized what was going on when Rebecca, the hostess, suddenly appeared from behind them all, and she also began clapping her hands. Unlike her questionable demeanor from this morning, she was now smiling in front of everyone. Her character was now allowed to do so. My fellow guests began to smile when the penny finally dropped. Some were relieved that this had all been a game and that the fallen tree was also a part of it. Apparently, the reason why the booking had to be made so long in advance was because the waiting list to put someone you know forward as the main suspect was huge. That was why I had to be the last guest to enter the house for the story to synchronize. When I was greeted rudely by the hostess, I was supposed to get annoyed and snap at her, which would then trigger her to make a scene, allowing the other guests to observe. But when I had lost my tongue, the chef had to jump in. But what I didn't know, up until my altercation with Rebecca, was that she had been friendly and polite to the other guests. This would be a pivotal point when she would purposely turn and suddenly act distressed and victimized. Furthermore, making it appear as though, to my fellow guests, I had poor morals, so later I would become targeted as the suspect. From there, all the alterations between the staff, who were also actors, helped play out the storyline. Were the other guests able to see past my first impressions and tie all the clues together to catch the real killer? Clearly not, until I had to step in and play detective. As Harper and I walked back to the car park, she joked that she had been working on her Irish accent for the past 9 months, and how she barely slept the night before from worrying that she would give the game away. She also managed to reveal a minor detail from earlier, when I wasn't able to work out where the couple had been arguing when I first arrived at the property. It turns out they had installed speakers hidden in the trees that played people arguing in a loop, to foreshadow the rift between a father and daughter. In the distance, we watched as a front excavator lifted the tree trunk from off the road before placing it on the verge beside it, and then the excavator went on its way back along the narrow road. "See, Dad," Harper said with glee as she wrapped her arm around my shoulder. "See how much fun that was. Will you start listening to me now and go get yourself out there?" I found myself at a loss for words, only because she was right. I had been in my own little bubble for far too long, and it was about time I stopped wasting my youth, or what was left of it, before it was well and truly gone. As we entered the car park, I couldn't help but notice the parked blue BMW with its interior completely filled with smoke. Then I heard a man's voice call out behind me, "Open the windows, for God's sake." I turned around to find the remaining Sherlock brother standing still with his arms in the air. He was clearly annoyed at the sight of the car. As soon as he shouted, the car windows were immediately drawn down as the smoke was slowly drawn outside. "What did I tell you about smoking weed in my car?" The remaining Sherlock shouted again, dismayed, as he edged closer to the BMW. The mystery of where the other Sherlock brothers had disappeared was finally revealed. They both were coughing uncontrollably as the air inside the car finally cleared. The brothers' coughs quickly developed into giggles as they chuckled amongst themselves like naughty schoolkids.